Hey everybody, back with another Polars tutorial. Hope you're all doing real well. Today I'm going to be talking about reshaping data. In other words, going from wide format to long format, and then back from long format to wide format again. That can be a tricky thing to do in data science packages. It can be a tricky thing to get it right, and there's all sorts of contingencies you have to deal with sometimes. So I'll try to give an introduction to it and just show you some of the ways that I do it. Again, there's lots of ways to do it, so if there's a different way that you find better, definitely write it in the comments and I'd be happy to take a look. So right now I'm actually going to start out with some data that's stored in wide format, and we're going to start out by just moving this to long format. So we have some test scores, so 3 tests, and then the corresponding letter grades for those tests. And so we want to have these test scores and these grades in a singular column, and we want the name here to repeat 3 times over, 1 time for each of the scores and grades. So the first way I'll show you how to go from wide to long format is with the unpivot method. And the way you use this is it's a data frame method. So you create a new data set or a new data frame. I'm creating a new data frame. And then you point to the input data set. The input data set I have is just called grades. And then just .unpivot. And then there's 4 arguments that you can use to go from wide to long format. The first thing you need to specify is an index variable or variables, and the index variable is going to be the unique ID. And so in this case, it's the name column that we have here. And so these are going to repeat on output. In other words, when we generate the output data set, these are going to repeat 3 times over. And then we need to specify the variables that we want to store in one column. So in this case, and we do that with the on argument. And so in this case, we're going to store these 3 test values into one column. And then there's a couple of other optional arguments. It'll make a little bit more sense once we take a look at the output what these do. But First is the variable name option, and that's the name to give to the variable column. And so this variable contains the original variable name. So in other words, it's going to contain a value for test 1, test 2, and test 3. And so we're just going to call this test number. And then there's the value name, and that's the name to give the value column, and that stores the actual value. So this 81, the 75, the 71, that'll go into the value column. And so I'm just going to call that test score. I'm going to sort by name just to make it easier to look at. So we can go ahead and run this and take a look. My terminal is just always like crazy with all this stuff on it. Okay. What happened here? Oh. All right, there we go. Okay, so there's our data that has been pivoted from wide format to long format, and we see that the name repeats 3 times over. We have a value demarcating the test number, and then we have the corresponding test score. What the heck did I just do? Okay, getting too adventurous with my clicks. Now, if you're following along, you're probably noticing a problem. And the problem here is that we have multiple groups of columns that we need to reshape, grades and test scores, and we don't want to store test score in the same column as grade. So how can we do that? How can we get a column for both test score and a column for grades where we store the corresponding grades for each one? The way I usually handle that, and there may be other ways to do it, but I just like to keep things simple and easy. And so another way to do it is to go from wide to long by exploding lists. And so the first thing we're going to do is create a list out of each of the columns that we're interested in. So we're going to create a list for the specific grades, and then we're also going to create a list for the specific tests. And I'm calling this list grades and this list scores. You know what? We'll actually just go ahead and take a look at this before we explode it, just to get an idea of what we're going to do, because some of you may not be familiar with .explode and what it does. Okay, there we go. So as we see here, we have a list for grades and a list for scores. Now what explode is going to do is it's going to take the first element of each of these lists and turn that into a row. It's going to take the second element and turn that into another row. And so basically it's going to take each of these corresponding elements and create a row out of them. And we'll retain the column name grades and scores. And so the way you explode lists, I feel like I printed unpivot twice. Whoops. And so the way we explode lists is just by specifying the data frame and then saying .explode, and then in parenthesis write in the list columns that we want to explode. And so I'll keep the name, the grades column, and the scores column. So we will take a look at this and see how it works. Okay, so here's our output when we reshaped using lists instead. And so as you can see, lists offer a pretty flexible way to reshape your data. Now the only downside to this is that when you have multiple groupings of variables that you need to reshape, there needs to be the same number of elements. So if there were only 2 tests, for example, and 3 grades, this isn't going to work, but there's an easy fix that you can do. So if you try that, you'll just get an error back that says shape error, exploded columns must have matching element counts. And so this has 3 elements, this has 2. So a really easy way to fix that, if you do have some not so clean data that you're working with, is you can just write in a none there, and that'll fill in that extra row with a missing value. So we'll take a look at what that looks like if we were to do that. Yeah, so the third test would just have a missing value there. So there are some options, and it's an additional thing you can consider. But we'll go ahead and leave it as this since our data is nice and clean. Okay, so those are the 2 ways that I go from wide format to long format. So I either use pivot or I either collapse lists and generate the output that way. So now we'll talk about going from long format to wide format. Now this is maybe some complicated syntax that I have here because I called my data set up here unpivot. What I'm going to do there is repivot that to wide format. So how do we do that? And so we use the pivot method for that. And pivot's going to have 3 essential arguments. First, we need an ID variable or an index column, and our index column here is going to be name. And so we're going to repivot this guy. And so name is going to be our index column. It's going to be our ID column. Then there's an on argument, and on represents the values that will serve as the new column names. So in other words, this test number here, this is going to create a column called test1, and a second column called test2, and a third column called test3. And so we specify test number for that, and then there is a values column, and the values argument represents the actual values we need to unpack. And so we're unpacking test score here, and so that'll create 3 new columns, columns called test1, test2, and test3, and it'll store these corresponding values in those columns. So we'll just take I'm calling this data set wide, so we'll just go ahead and run this and take a look at the widened data. Okay, so there's our now flattened data that has been transposed from long format to wide format. So pivoting is pretty easy, but the one barrier to using pivot effectively is that we need a variable for this on column. In other words, a variable column that tells polars what to name each new variable, and that's not always going to be available in your data. So that begs a question, like what happens if we don't have a column for the on argument? So we're almost always going to have an index column, and we'll almost always know the values that we need to unpack, but we're not always going to have a column that tags the specific names that these columns need to get. So another option I like to use is I like to collapse the data using lists, and then I extract each of those individual elements out of the lists and create columns that way. In order to do this effectively, though, so that you are naming and storing the data appropriately, is you need to make sure that your data is sorted properly prior to collapsing. So in other words, you really want to make sure that, say, this column actually is the first test, this column is actually the second test, and this is actually the third test. And so we're going to reshape this lists column right here, this lists data set right here, since it doesn't have a good variable to serve as an on argument in a pivot method. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to group by, and we're going to group by name, and we're going to group by name because they are repeated values for these names, and it is the ID column. And then we're going to ag without specifying an aggregation method. And when you do that, Polars does something pretty curious. What it's going to do is it's just going to smash all the variables into a singular list. And so before we actually take a look at the with columns method where we extract everything, we'll just take a look at what the intermediate data looks like that we're going to be working with. Okay, so after we do our group by and our aggregation, where we don't specify an aggregation method, we see what Polars did is it created one row for each case represented by a name. And we have two lists, a list for grades and then a list for scores. And so we can really easily extract each of these values and create columns out of these. And I do have another video on lists if you are so inclined to take a look. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to pass this intermediate data set to a with columns method, and here we can extract each of these elements. So we can go test 1 through 3, grade 1 through 3, and we can point to the column or the list that stores our data, and we can do .list and then .get, and then the element refers to the or the argument in here, the integer argument, refers to the corresponding position that we want to extract from. So element 0 refers to this first item in the list. Element 1 and 2 refer to the subsequent items. So we'll just go ahead and extract these and take a look at our resulting data. Okay, so here are our extracted values. We see this 61 here that does correspond to the first score in that list. The 82 refers to the second score, as well as the grades. Okay, guys, so that's how you move from wide to long format and long to wide format using Polars. As you can see, there's a lot of different options. The pivot and unpivot methods are probably going to be the default options you'll want to start with. If it turns out that your data doesn't really, that your data makes using those methods quite difficult, there are some other methods you can use as well. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.